الوفاء بشتى الصور، أحب الوفي الأمين الأغر، فأهل الوفاء كلون السحاب.
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulullah. All praise is due to Allah, and may His peace and blessings be on the last messenger of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's my great pleasure to be with you today and to talk about this most important topic. Women in Islam is the most prevalent stereotype. The oppression of women is the most prevalent stereotype about Islam in the US right now. And so having the opportunity to speak about this topic and to sort of shed some light on, what are some of the misconceptions and what are some ways that we can sort of push back against those and explain those in a way that is relevant and relatable to an American audience, right? So that's something that's very important. I want to start by a quote from Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson once said that an educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as a free people. And I think his words could never be more true than they are today, right? As Muslims and as Americans, it's so important for us living in this democracy to be well informed, right? So for people who are not Muslim, that means getting to know a little bit about Islam. That means getting to know a little bit about their Muslim neighbors. For those who are Muslim, it means getting familiar with what the stereotypes are and being able to answer them in an intelligent and respectful way, right? Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to become defensive on the one hand, but we also don't want to be apologetic as well, right? We want to be confident about who we are and what we believe. We want to be able to give intelligent answers to questions that people have, and we don't want to do that, while being either arrogant about our faith or being ashamed about our faith, right? We want to strike that nice middle ground, and Islam is all about balance, right? So there's no surprise there. And so, as Americans, our democracy, our very system of government, it depends on having well-educated citizens, right? That's the only way that we can protect, the freedoms and the religious pluralism that we have in this country is to get to know one another. So that's very important. A lot of times, we might see something that's on TV or in the news or in our news feed, and we might just immediately assume that it's correct. But as critical thinkers in the 21st century, we have to really ask ourselves, is it true just because it's on TV? Is it true just because it's in my news feed? Is it true just because some people that appear smart and powerful are saying it's true? Not necessarily, right? As critical thinkers and as Muslims, we need to objectively evaluate the claims that other folks are making, right? Whether that has to do with Islam or with anything else. We have to use our thinking, the intellect that Allah gave us, and analyze things. So today, the topic is specifically about the 4 greatest women in Islam. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But what I'm going to do first is I want to start by, talking about women in general. Because like I said in the beginning, the most prevalent stereotype about Muslims is that we oppress women, right? A lot of folks also have a stereotype about Islam being a violent religion, but when you look at the data, the stereotype about women is actually much more prevalent. And so that's why it's important for those who are Muslim to have, good answers to some of those questions that come up, right? And I'm sure, some of you may have had those questions asked of you, right? Whether you're Muslim women, or Muslim men as well. I mean, how many of you have ever gotten asked a question about women in Islam? Has anybody ever had that happen? Yeah? Would anyone care to share? What are some questions that you've ever gotten, or what are some common stereotypes that people ask you?
So, one of my coworkers, she asked me if I wear a hijab because I was forced to, or towards my work. I obviously said that it was my choice. So then she replied by saying, I think you're hiding yourself.
Interesting.
I didn't know how to respond back to
Yeah. I think when it comes to the issue of hijab, that's probably, for most people of other faiths, that's the most obvious thing that they notice about us. And I was listening to a lecture by one of my mentors, Dalia Mugahid, where she was talking about this topic, and I learned something very interesting that I never knew before. What she said is that the reason why a lot of folks in this country have a misconception about the hijab, that it's forced and that it makes us inferior, is actually because of the way that hijab is talked about in the Bible. In the Bible, the hijab is mentioned as being a way of women understanding and accepting that they are inferior to men. Okay, so naturally, if you're coming from that standpoint, you would maybe apply the same assumption to anybody that you see wearing that, right? If that's what your own, tradition says, then a lot of people say, well, we stopped doing that a long time ago. You don't have to do it. You don't have to do it. We stopped doing that a long time ago. That's because they're coming from a totally different paradigm. There's nothing in the Quran that says we wear hijab because we're inferior, right? We would laugh at that, right? What are some other things that some of you may have heard or been asked?
Most people, they have misconceptions between the religious side of how it's women should be treated and how the cultural side, when they match those two together, especially in the Middle Eastern cultures. So I feel like the community struggles with that a lot.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The whole distinction between what does Islam actually say versus what was I raised with back home, or what were my parents raised with back home. This can cause a lot of contention for a lot of Muslims in the US, right? And it's unfortunate. And really there's no easy answer to that except to gain more knowledge of Islam. There's really no other way. I mean, you can fight and argue with your parents and your family and so on, but until you have the knowledge for yourself, you're really not in a position to be able to intelligently debate those things, right? And it just becomes nothing more than just a power struggle, and that's not very productive or constructive, right? Yeah, sure.
So, coming from a non-Muslim community, it's different for them to understand that our religion should be studied and everything, and then us Muslim girls or women have to struggle with the cultural aspect of that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's hard to explain to them.
Right. I mean, often, in my work, one of the things that I talk about in my unapologetically Muslim classes that I do is the fact that as Muslims in America, we have challenges from all sides. It's not just coming from one direction, it's coming from all directions. And that's, again, a big reason why the more knowledge that you can gain, and the more communication skills you can gain, I think that's a big part of it too, the better off you're going to be. A lot of people do have the knowledge, but sometimes they don't exactly know how to convey it, especially to people who are coming from a different paradigm than them, right? I want to share with you a quote by Dr. Rochelle Terman. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford. And this is what she said about perception of Muslims as misogynists and how the media portrayals of Muslims feeds directly into that. What she said is that US media consumers are fed a particularly pernicious stereotype of Muslims, that they are distinctly sexist and misogynistic. This paints Muslims as a cultural threat to Western values. Since most Americans do not have direct contact with Muslims in their daily lives, media seriously influences public attitudes about Islam. And this brings up another very important factor that helps to combat prejudice. I mentioned a few, one of them is just becoming more educated, becoming more informed about Islam and Muslims. Another one is just getting to know a Muslim personally. That research has shown is a very powerful factor in helping to lessen Islamophobia. Even if you don't know a terrible, a whole lot about Islam, even if you have never studied it, people who have a Muslim friend are much less likely to exhibit or express Islamophobic views. So how many of you, have friends of other faiths and try to sort of, have dialogue with them, or at least help them get to know you? Because, I think that the best, most effective dawah is just your interaction with people, right? Before you've even said your first word about what Islam teaches or what Muslims believe, what people notice first is how you treat them, right? That's what people notice first. Any brothers on this side, any of you ever been asked? I know for the women a lot of times it's immediately hijab is what the question is when it comes to women. But have you all ever gotten asked questions about the status of women in Islam or hijab or anything at all related to women? Yeah. What have you?
Well, it's kind of weird, but like someone was asking me about oh, why do women have to cover up themselves and I have to wear shorts and stuff like that. And, I mean, I kind of just explained it's not really that they're allowed to wear shorts. There's different things they have to cover versus.
Right. So as Muslims, we do observe the fact that men have certain rules of modesty as well. But to say that the rules are same for men and women, they're not the same, right? They're different. Anyone else? Yeah.
I've brought up the question about, why don't the men that women work in Islam? Some women are not allowed, some daughters come and say, my father won't let me work.
That is a very common one. In fact, someone asked my husband that the other day. He's like, "Oh, so does your wife work?" And he's like, "No. Well, I mean, I work a lot of volunteer things, but mostly from home. I do go out and speak like I am here, but I don't really have a 9-to-5 job." And so their next question was, "Well, why don't you let her work?" And he's like, "She worked for many years, and she's free to work if she chooses to." I actually started my career in corporate IT, so I worked as a programmer, a web developer, a help desk analyst. So I worked in many different roles. But yeah, I think, and what you said over here relates to that as well, which is this whole notion that whether it's the choice of working, whether it's the choice of covering, it's never the woman herself who's making that choice. That's the assumption, right? Anyone else have anything to share? One more person? And then we'll move on? Yeah.
Somebody asked me, do they take showers in the stars?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, do you shower with that on? Do you sleep with that on? One of the funniest quotes that I ever read, and I tell you, when I read this, I was just rolling laughing. My daughter was like, "Mommy, it's not that funny." Is that I cover my hair, not my brain. I really like that, because I think a lot of people assume that because Muslim women cover, that they're somehow less intelligent. Isn't that funny? So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, stereotypes when it comes to women. As some of you mentioned, one of them is the hijab. And I think there's a lot of ways that you can answer that question, right? Depending on the person that's asking you. I think one thing is, and I learned this in a training that I attended called Faith Over Fear. It was a training for interfaith leaders to learn how to combat Islamophobia. It's done by the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign. And one of the things they say is when someone comes to you upset about something they believe Islam teaches or Muslims do, a good place to start is to match the emotion without agreeing with the claim. So let me explain what I mean by that. If someone says that, it makes me so mad when I see that, when I see Muslim women covering because the fact that men make them do it is so unfair. You could say something like, if that were true, that would be terrible. Like if the only reason Muslim women are covering is because men are forcing them to do it, yeah, I'm with you, that would be a terrible thing, right? Our faith actually teaches that there is no compulsion in religion, right? And that when we do a good deed, we do it for the sake of God, right? God is the gold standard, not men, not women, right? That's an important distinction. And the thing is that in a society that takes God out of the picture, who's left to emulate, right? It's men, right? And so what we see here is that women And Islam is totally different, but what we see here is that women often derive their value in one of two ways. One is by attracting men, and the other is by imitating men, right? Right? Is that true? And does anybody agree with that? The way we find our self-worth is if I can be appealing in a physical way to men, that makes me worthy, or if I can be just like men. I'm sure most of you have heard the famous saying, anything a man can do, a woman can do better. How many of you have heard that? Anyone heard that? Yeah. So my answer to that is, well, sometimes that might be true, but here's the real question. Why would a woman want to do everything a man can do? Right? Allah made us distinct. He made each of us unique. So why would I want to do everything that a man can do? In order to really understand, I think, the status of women in Islam and to push back against a lot of these stereotypes about this unfairness, the sense that it's so unfair that Muslim women are forced to, do all these things, is to emphasize the concept of justice in Islam. Justice is such an important concept. The idea that, no one is allowed to oppress anyone, anywhere, for any reason, right? Men are not allowed to oppress women, and women aren't allowed to oppress men either, right? You might say, well, how do women oppress men? Well, we nag them so much, right? That can be a type of oppression too. Harvard Law School invited their faculty, staff, and students to choose their favorite quotes about justice. So they received 150 submissions. And of those 150 submissions, they selected 3 that they displayed at the entrance of, at the faculty entrance of their law school. The 3 that were unanimously chosen were a quote from St. Augustine, a quote from the Magna Carta, and a verse from the Quran. So here is the verse from the Quran that is displayed outside of the faculty entrance at Harvard Law School. And this is chapter 4, verse 135. O ye who believe, stand out firmly for justice, as witnesses to Allah, even as against yourselves, or your parents, or your kin, and whether it be against rich or poor, for Allah can best protect both. That's a really powerful statement about justice, right? That whether even you yourself have done something wrong, you need to come forward, you need to share that. The verse number was 4. Chapter 4, verse 135, and if you want to know more about this particular, this particular project, you can go to their website, which is library.law.harvard.edu. So if you go to that website, library.law.harvard.edu, you will actually see all 3 of the quotes that they have. You see a picture of it as well, displayed outside of their faculty entrance. And there's also the hadith in Imam Nawawi's 40 hadith collection. This is hadith number 24, where, and this is a hadith Qudsi, where Allah says, O my servants, I have forbidden oppression for myself, and I have made it forbidden amongst you. So do not oppress one another, right? That's so important, right? Again, this idea that oppression in any form, for any reason, at any time, is never allowed in Islam, right? So how do we describe then the relationship between men and women in Islam? The best way that we can describe it is that men and women are equal but not same. Because a lot of times when we talk, especially in social justice circles, when we talk about equality or feminism, what we're really saying is we're demanding that men and women be exactly the same. And our faith doesn't teach that, right? Sometimes people will ask, well, you're talking, you're saying Islam, promotes the rights of women and women are equal, so are you a feminist? And that's a tricky question, because that concept has so many different ways of interpreting it, right? If feminism means male bashing, then no, neither me nor my faith supports that, right? Because we don't see men as the enemy, we see shaitan as the enemy. Shaitan is the enemy of us both, right? We're not going around saying, oh, all men are pigs and this and that. No, we're partners of each other, right? There's no such thing as, I'm gonna elevate myself at your expense. It doesn't work that way. Because what happens is if you try to do that, and the reverse is also true, if men try to uplift themselves at the expense of women, it ends up being a lose-lose. The only way for either of us to win is to win together, right? That's what our faith teaches us. So if by feminism you mean, upholding the equality of men and women, upholding the dignity of men and women, the fact that both men and women deserve to be respected, then of course, we have no problem with that. But when it goes to, hating on men or male bashing, no, that's not what our faith teaches us, right? Because any kind of disrespect, whichever way it goes, is not what we are about. That's not Muslim character, whether you're a man or a woman, right? So do you guys agree with that? That's a basic part. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ was sent to perfect good character. If good character is not there, then nothing is there, right? Character is the indication of faith in the heart, right? And that's not to say that, as long as you're a good person, you don't have to do anything else. No, Islam is balanced, so it means you have to have good manners and good character, but you also have to practice the ritual aspects of the religion as well, right? All of it comes together as a complete package. And I don't want you to get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that Muslims never oppress women. I mean, it does happen, right? Are there Muslim men who oppress women? Yes. Are there Muslim men who oppress women in the name of Islam? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. But does Islam itself oppress women? I believe it does not, right? One really great hadith that kind of really summarizes the whole Islamic concept of how men are taught to treat women is in the final sermon that the Prophet ﷺ delivered, one of his most famous khutbahs ever, where he said, "O people, it is true that you have certain rights with regard to your women, but they also have rights over you. Remember that you have taken them as your wives only under Allah's trust and with His permission." So again, with the permission of who? With the permission of Allah, right? So Allah is the ultimate authority, not men. And then he goes on to say, do treat your women well and be kind to them, for they are your partners and committed helpers. So again, this idea that we are, partners of one another, and we're not, one of us trying to raise ourselves up by pushing the other one down, right? Because that's just a lose-lose. One of the questions that sometimes comes up, I would say hijab is probably the most common question, but another one that often gets asked is inheritance. Does anyone ever get asked about that? Yeah, you're shaking your head, right? So why do women in Islam get half, in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, why do women get half the inheritance of men? The fact that women get half in most cases is actually very generous to women. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Any money that a man has, he is required to support himself, his wife, his children, his parents, and if he has any unmarried sisters, he's required to support them as well. Any money that a woman has, she doesn't even have to pay for her own basic expenses. Now, if she chooses to spend on her family or anyone, she's absolutely allowed to do that. Her money belongs to her, and she's allowed to spend it in any way she likes. But according to law, she is not required to support her own self. And so all the money that she gets in inheritance is actually just her spending money. So when you put it that way, it's actually incredibly generous to women that they get half. Would you agree with that? Men, again, have to support so many people out of that money that they receive. And women are not required to do any of that. And a lot of times, because we have seen or experienced women being treated unfairly because of whether it's because of culture or just family upbringing or whatever, when we get asked questions about women in Islam, sometimes we become a little bit defensive. And we put, American culture on this pedestal. And we're desperately trying to match the high standard that women have achieved here. But if you look at, for example, the Me Too movement, the idea of women, being abused at the hands of men is not something unique to Islam in any way, right? So what I say is that, look, on the one hand, we don't deny that oppression of women occurs. We don't deny that. In fact, we don't deny that it happens even among Muslims. And we don't even deny that some Muslims who do it in the name of Islam. We don't deny any of that. But here's what I want you to remember. Muslims do not have a monopoly on misogyny. Okay? Muslims do not have a monopoly on misogyny. This is a human problem and not uniquely a Muslim problem. So we're not denying that it exists. We're not saying that, we're not trying to brush it under the rug. But what we are saying with full confidence is that when it does happen, it is despite Islam and not because of Islam. And secondly, that when it happens, whether it's a Muslim or anybody else, we, along with you, hurt when we see that. It's terrible, right? We're not saying that it's okay. We're saying that when it does happen, it's terrible, but we don't believe that it's our faith that teaches us that, right? Another question that I've heard a couple of times, and let me know if you've been asked this question. I remember in 2 different open houses, this was one of the very few questions that was asked. Why do women stand behind men in the congregational prayer? Anybody ever gotten that before? Yeah, you have? Anybody? Yeah. You too? Okay. So yeah, this is something that is another one of those questions that, once people start to kind of learn about Islam and they find this out, it's a sticking point, and people kind of stop and they go, wait, that for sure is unfair. You can tell me the hijab, they do it because it's their own choice. You can tell me the inheritance is still very generous because women are not even required to support anybody from that money, whereas men are, required to support so many people. But how do you explain to me the fact that it's fair for women to stand behind men? And this is what I would tell you. In order to understand why women pray behind men, you need to know something about the Muslim prayer. The Muslim prayer is a very physical prayer, right? We have postures ranging from standing with our arms folded to bowing to prostrating. In other words, bending over while standing and bending over while seated on the ground. How many men would be able to focus on their prayer if the women were standing in front of them? Not too many. And how many women would be comfortable with men standing behind them watching them as they pray? Not too many, right? Now you might say, well, some men might feel uncomfortable, right? Because one is going to be in front and one is going to be in back. And this is how I would answer that. Yes, it's correct that some men might feel somewhat uncomfortable standing in front of women when they pray, but we are okay letting the men be a little bit uncomfortable rather than letting the women be really uncomfortable. And guys, sorry, right? That's just the way it is. So this is one way that you can attempt that question. It really, what it is really there's just an assumption that being in front is better and being behind is not. But really that's not true at all, right? It's simply a function of the fact that the Muslim prayer is a physical prayer, right? And I don't think any of us here would want to be standing in front of the men when we do it, right? Before I move on to the next topic, which is the 4 greatest women in Islam, I want to share with you one, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Again, back to the topic of women in prayer, I've been asked why don't the women ever lead the prayer, whether it's in front or behind. haven't they ever dated both of them?
So again, well, there's two parts to the answer for that. One is that if there are only women around and there are no men around, women do lead prayer for other women. But if women were to lead prayer for men, again, we would go back to the same problem of them standing in front of the men. Simple as that, right? It's all a question of protecting the privacy of women at the expense of, yes, letting the men be just a little bit uncomfortable, right? Salama, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, once asked him, why does the Quran address the men all the time? Why are there, verses about women? And Allah revealed this verse, which is chapter 33, verse 35. Indeed, the Muslim men and Muslim women, the believing men and believing women, the obedient men and obedient women, the truthful men and truthful women, the patient men and patient women, the humble men and humble women, the charitable men and charitable women, the fasting men and fasting women, the men who guard their private parts and the women who do so, the men who remember Allah often and the women who do so. For them, Allah has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. And this is it's sort of just reminding us that, everywhere in the Quran where we see the pronoun he, it's really talking to both of us, right? It's not excluding women. This verse is a reminder of that. In the Arabic language, everything is either masculine or feminine, right? Some people even ask about Allah, why is he a he, why can't he be a she? Allah is just a singular entity, right? It's a proper name for God. It's a singular entity. And the idea is that everything is one or the other, so if something is not specifically female, then it is mentioned as male. But the fact that the verses mostly are in the male form do not mean that they're excluding women. And this verse is simply a reminder of that. So any other questions about, stereotypes or misconceptions related to women in general before we move on? Anybody? Yeah.
How do you answer the question about men being able to marry multiple wives?
Right. So yeah, that's another very common one. My daughter once told me that in a college class that she was taking, I think this was at Wayne, it was a class about Muslim history. And so the professor, when he introduced the topic of Islam, what is Islam? He mentioned the 5 pillars, and then he said, and men can have 4 wives. As if it's like one of the most fundamental parts of the faith, that we pray 5 times a day, we fast in Ramadan, we go for Hajj, we do this, and then men can marry more than one. There's a factual way to answer that question, and there's also a funny way to answer that question, so I'm going to start with the funny way. When we say that men can have 4 wives, that is a true statement. If we say, well, why can't women have 4 wives? 4 husbands. 4 husbands. And so what I would say to that is that that's a fair question, but no married woman is ever asking that question. Because I guarantee you, if you ask a married woman whether she's Muslim or not, if she would like to have an extra husband, she's probably going to say thanks, but no thanks. I have my hands full with just one. That's the funny way to answer that. The factual way to answer that is that there are more women in the world than men. This is just a fact. So when we say that every man can only have 1 wife, what we're basically saying is that a whole bunch of women in the world don't deserve a husband. That's what we're saying. Right? Do you agree with me? If there are more women than men, and we're saying that every man can only marry 1, we're basically saying that a whole lot of women don't deserve to be married. They don't deserve to have a husband. Now, no woman wants to share their husband, right? I mean, this is only natural, right? And this is something that we acknowledge. And the rules for doing it are so strict that most men wouldn't want to try. because the equality with which you have to treat all four, the standard of that is so difficult to obtain that if you are God-fearing, you'd rather not do it. The other thing is that in this country, polygamy is not permitted by law. Now some scholars will say, well, it's permitted in our faith, so we should still be allowed to do it here. Here's the problem with that. Only your first wife is going to be able to be legally married to you, and she's the only one that under law is gonna have certain rights with respect to you. Any other wife that you marry beyond that, her rights are not gonna be recognized by law because that marriage is not recognized by law. So are you now treating them equally? No, right? So it's really not possible in a society that only recognizes one marriage to have more than one and to treat them fairly, right? I hope that was helpful. Yeah, I mean, there's just so many different, questions that people can ask when it comes to women. I think the list just goes on and on and on. According to a survey, the American Muslim poll that ISPU conducted, I believe it was about 26% of Americans had this opinion that Islam itself was a misogynistic faith, compared to about 13% that believed that Islam was a violent religion. We often think that the one about violence is more common, but it's actually the other way around. There was also a poll done of people who are left-leaning, meaning Democrat, people who tend to vote Democrat, and generally speaking, people who vote Democrat are more accepting of Muslims and other minorities as a whole. But even among those people, about 30% had the stereotype about women, right? So it is, there's many different, questions that can come up with that. And obviously the best thing we can do is try to become better informed. I'm actually at the end gonna share some resources with you. I'm gonna share 3 websites that are, in my own experience, they're great resources for learning about answers to a lot of these questions in a way that is, relevant and relatable, living in the US right now. So make sure you make a note of those at the end, because I think, those will be very beneficial to you. So, when we talk about the 4 greatest women in Islam, alhamdulillah, our history is filled with incredible women. It's filled with incredible women. The scholar Muhammad Akram Medwi, he set out to write a book about the female scholars of hadith. So just the scholars, and just in one branch of Islamic science, which is hadith science. He thought he might find, 20 or 30 women, he'd fill one book. He found over 8,000 women, and he filled over 40 volumes. You can get the, I believe it's like the introduction. It's called Al-Muhaddithat, which means female hadith scholars. And it's a testament to the fact that we have a very, very rich history of women scholars and women just being active and engaged in every field. We know that even during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was a woman by the name of Nusayba bint Ka'b who actually protected him in the Battle of Uhud. So she wasn't there as a warrior, she was there to help nurse the wounded. But when she saw, after the archers left the hill and the Prophet ﷺ was in a compromised position, he was in danger, she grabbed a spear and she went and she defended him. And she was actually wounded in that battle. And this was in his time. This is not something in recent time, this is in his time. We have Fatma al-Fihri, who was the founder of the oldest university that still exists today. So we have countless stories of women throughout our past. But today I want to focus on the 4, right? The 4 that the Prophet ﷺ himself mentioned as the greatest women in all the worlds. And here's the hadith from Tirmidhi where we find this saying. From among the women of the world who have reached perfection and who are worthy of following are 4. Maryam, the daughter of Imran, Khadija, daughter of Khuwaylid, Fatima, daughter of Muhammad, and Asiya, wife of Pharaoh. So two of these women were from his household, right? Khadija radiallahu anha and Fatima radiallahu anha. One was his first wife and one was his daughter, the only child of his that survived him. In other words, the only child that lived longer than he did. She died 6 months after he did. And Khadija, his first wife. Khadija was known as Tahira, the pure one. Khadija shattered so many stereotypes. She was older than him, she was more powerful than him, she was wealthier than him, and she proposed to him, right? She was 40 when he was 25. She was a business owner, a very wealthy business owner, and he was one of her employees, right? Because she was so wealthy, there were many men who sought her hand in marriage, but she chose our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Why? Because of his integrity. So Tahira was married to Al-Sadiq Al-Amin. What a beautiful marriage. And theirs is one of the best love stories of all time. When you read about how he used to remember her, it's just amazing. She was obviously the first believer in Islam, the first one to believe in him. When he came back running from the cave and he was scared and he said, cover me up, cover me up. Instead of standing there and hounding him with 1,001 questions, well, who was it? Or what happened? Or why did you ask this? She's like, you know what, don't worry. Allah is never going to forsake you. He's never going to humiliate you. She instantly comforted him. And this is a quality that we should try to emulate as well, right? She was his confidant, she was his pillar of support emotionally, financially, in every way. And then we have Fatima, radiallahu anha. So picture this. Fatima is 10 years old, okay? Her father is at the Kaaba, he's praying. And the Quraysh, they decide, because they want to do everything they can to hurt and humiliate the Prophet and the Muslims, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they ask, who is going to go and bring the intestines of a camel and throw it on his back? So one of them does. Now you're Fatima, you're 10 years old, you're not even there. She finds out that this has happened. Rather than be scared and stay in her house and find someone to do something, she runs. She runs there. And these men, these are the most powerful men of the Quraysh. And she knows that they are out to kill. They're not just like mean, like saying mean things. They're dangerous men, right? She's 10 years old, and what does she do? She runs right up to them. She removes all of the filth on her father's back, and she faces them, right? That's a story of courage. That's a story of courage. Fatima led a life of extreme poverty, but she was always patient with her circumstances. And her father loved her so much. When she would walk into a room, he would stand up to greet her. Their father-daughter relationship was one of the most beautiful father-daughter relationships ever. Now the other two women are well before the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we have Asiya. Now Asiya is a woman of piety, but she's married to one of the worst tyrants in human history. Most other women in her situation would simply do whatever the guy said, right? Just out of fear of their own safety. When Asiya heard the message of the oneness of Allah from Musa, her stepson, who she raised, right? She accepted it right away. She hid at first that she had accepted the faith. But eventually she came to a point where she had to tell. And so she tried to run away. But her husband, he had men sent out to find her, they brought her back, and he began to torture her. Now, most of us in that situation, faced with this incredibly powerful man who tells people he is God himself, right? No one has any power to stop him. We would be scared, wouldn't we? We would be scared. We would say, well, if I just, renounce my being, maybe Allah will forgive me, because what am I really supposed to do in this case, right? But she was brave. She held fast to her faith until her death. She's laying down, she's strapped to the floor. Pharaoh has this huge boulder that's about to fall on her body. She's watching all of this, right? When she sees this, she makes a dua to Allah, and this dua is in the Quran. Asiya makes a dua where she says, and this is in chapter number 66, ayah number 11. My Lord, build for me near you a house in paradise, and save me from Pharaoh and his deeds, and save me from the wrongdoing people. Again, this is chapter 66, verse 11. The moment she makes this dua, Allah takes her soul. So although the boulder does still fall on her, it falls on her lifeless body. Allah's already taken her. And actually before that, I forgot to mention, when she makes this dua, in that brief moment before her making the dua and her soul being taken, Allah actually shows her her home in paradise. She actually gets to see it. And then he takes her soul and she is free from the bondage of being married to this tyrant. Maryam alayhi salam, there's an entire chapter named after her. Her name actually means the purified, right? Kind of like At-Tahira for Khadija. And there are so many places in the Quran where she's mentioned. She's mentioned a total of 34 times, which is even more than many prophets. And there are so many verses. If you go to chapter 3, verses 45 to 51, you can see much of the story. But even in other places, you will see her story being mentioned in bits and pieces. Right? She was a pillar of patience. I mean, when she was told by the angel Jibreel that she's going to bear a son, and she knew that no man had touched her, she knew what that was going to mean, that people were going to accuse her of things. And she had lived her whole life in chastity, in devout obedience to Allah. So when she figured this out, she put two and two together, she wished she had been dead. That's how desperate she was. And yet Allah comforted her. And we know that when she did give birth, and she brought Isa alayhi salam in front of the people, he actually spoke and defended his mother. As a baby, as a newborn, Allah caused him to speak. I'm running towards the end of my time. There's so much more that we can talk about when it comes to this topic, but I don't want to leave you without mentioning those resources that I talked about in the beginning. So I want you to just kind of maybe bookmark these or try to remember what they are. The first one is ing.org. ING stands for Islamic Networks Group, and they have a great set of resources on their website, including a set of FAQs. So these are frequently asked questions that people will often ask. So if you ever get asked a difficult question and you're not sure how to answer it, go to ing.org, look at their FAQs, and see if your question is answered. The other resource I want to tell you about is ispu.org. ISPU stands for the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. And back in 2016, I actually worked for ISPU as part of their research team. ISPU has really great resources about American Muslims. Both the challenges that we face, like bullying and discrimination, you'll find statistics on everything, as well as contributions that we make. So that's another great resource. And then the last one is shoulder-to-shouldercampaign.org. And this one is specifically, it gives you, again, all kinds of resources on how to combat Islamophobia. Shoulder to Shoulder is specifically for interfaith leaders. So the training that I told you about in the beginning, I was actually the only Muslim there in attendance. There were many Muslims on the panel, but the attendees were all Jewish and Christian faith leaders. So there were rabbis and pastors and other people who routinely volunteer at their church and temple, who were just, even though they were not Muslim themselves, they were dedicated to standing shoulder to shoulder with us to help us deal with this problem of Islamophobia. And so I just want to close by saying that, never stop learning more and more. The more you can learn about your faith, the more it's going to strengthen your own iman, and the more you're going to be able to practice it confidently in this day and age, right? The questions, the hostility is not going away, right? It's not going away. So we cannot just sit and hold our breath and wait for the current president to leave and then just hope that everything will go back and be okay. It's not, right? The hostility that he has unleashed is here to stay. So what we need to do is to get well informed. We need to learn as much as we can. We need to sharpen our communication skills as much as we can. And finally, we need to make an effort to step outside of our comfort zone and try to get to know people of other backgrounds and let them get to know us. Because if they get to know us as human beings, then I guarantee you that hostility is gonna melt away. Subhanaka wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Thank you so much.
كلون السحاب وحسن الربيع وماء المطر أحب الوفاء بشتى الصور أحب الوفي الأمين الأغر فأهل الوفاء كلون